The heavy burden of stale. The smell of body and clothes in medieval Europe. Medieval Europe is a world far from modern hygiene standards. People lived in cramped villages and towns, where every day brought a lot of physical difficulties, and caring for the cleanliness of the body and clothes remained far from the first place. But despite this, the unpleasant odor coming from the body and clothes was not something rare or unusual. On the contrary, he accompanied people everywhere, like an invisible companion that was impossible to just get rid of. Body and clothing odor is an integral part of life. In an era when access to clean water was limited and there were no opportunities for frequent water procedures, the human body was literally saturated with sweat, dirt, and secretions. Many medieval people spent their days and nights in the same clothes, which were rarely changed and almost never washed. Clothing made of coarse wool or linen absorbed sweat, sebaceous glands, and skin particles, becoming a source of persistent and pungent odor. The smell of sweat in the Middle Ages was not just a physiological phenomenon, but an integral part of everyday life, affecting social relations. Clothes soaked in the smells of labor, sweat, and dirt often demonstrated the status of a person. The poor and artisans smelled stronger than the nobility and clergy, who had at least some opportunity to take care of their cleanliness. However, even the nobles, surrounded by silk dresses and perfume, were not completely immune from unpleasant odors, because frequent bathing was considered harmful and could lead to diseases. Odors and their sources: work, clothing, and the environment. Many smells in medieval Europe came from work and lifestyle. Peasant families working in the fields from dawn to dusk were heavily polluted. Sweat, mixing with earth, manure, and vegetable juices, created a special fragrance that soaked into skin and clothing. In houses with wooden floors, burning fireplaces, and open windows, tar and smoke also left their mark, creating a complex bouquet of smells that were not always pleasant. In addition, the cities of that time were overflowing with garbage, sewage, which were poured directly onto the streets. The smell of rot and decay could mix with the scents of the human body and clothing, reinforcing the overall impression of stale. Such living conditions and streets did not contribute to maintaining cleanliness and provoked the appearance of a persistent odor. Lack of water treatments. Medieval Europe was famous for its attitude to bathing. Many believed that frequent water treatments are harmful to health, weaken the body, and make a person vulnerable to diseases. Many sacred texts and customs treated the body with some caution, which led to the abandonment of regular washing. Bathing was not so much a hygienic procedure as a ritual, and that was for a few. Water in most regions was difficult to access and often polluted, which also deterred people from washing frequently. Public baths, which once flourished in the early Middle Ages, fell into disrepair by the High Middle Ages due to concerns about the spread of diseases and moral turpitude. Thus, people could rarely refresh themselves with water, and body odor gradually accumulated. Sweat and its effects. Human sweat is a natural process aimed at cooling the body, but it also has a number of features. Unlike simple evaporation, sweat consists of water, salt, fats, and sebaceous gland secretions, which, upon contact with the skin, begin to decompose into bacteria. As a result, a specific unpleasant odor appears. In the absence of regular washing and changing clothes, sweat and its smell became a constant problem. It was often body odor that caused social exclusion, contributed to gossip, and even prejudice in society. However, due to their limited knowledge of hygiene, people considered it an unavoidable part of life. The smell of clothing and fabric features. The clothes worn in the Middle Ages were far from what we are used to seeing them today. It was mainly made from coarse fabrics such as wool, linen, and sometimes cotton. These materials strongly absorbed moisture and odors, and were rarely erased. Most of the clothes were heavy, dense, and often sewn from several layers, which aggravated the problem of ventilation and contributed to the accumulation of moisture. Even if the clothes were periodically ventilated, they remained saturated with the smells of sweat, dirt, and smoke. The difficulties of washing were not only the lack of clean water, but also the lack of detergents. Soap was expensive and not always available, and fabrics were washed more often using ash, alkali, and other abrasive substances that did not always effectively eliminate the odor. household odors, and nutrition. Another factor influencing body odor and the environment was diet and lifestyle. The diet of medieval man included a lot of spices, garlic, onions, and other pungent foods that not only gave a specific flavor to the breath, but also affected the body odor. In addition, many people smoked herbs, chewed chewing mixtures, and used incense to mask their natural odors. However, these measures were superficial and could not completely eliminate the unpleasant odors. Diseases and ailments born of dirt and stale. In medieval Europe, unpleasant body odor was not just the result of infrequent ablutions or wearing the same clothes for months. He was the harbinger and companion of many diseases that were born in the shadow of an unwashed body, rotting fabrics, and sweat-soaked linen. For a modern person, the idea that an everyday smell could mean hidden danger would seem obvious, but for the inhabitants of the 14th or 15th century, it was not so. They rarely associated the stench with an infection or internal ailment. Only a few doctors and monks, armed with the rudiments of medical knowledge, guessed that the stench was a sign of putrefaction and disease, causing processes. A microcosm invisible to the eye. At that time, people still did not know about bacteria, viruses, and microbes. However, their world was teeming with them. Colonies of parasites lived on the skin, in the folds of clothes, in bed linen, and in the hair. Fleas, lice, ticks, and with them whole armies of invisible pathogens of skin diseases. Where the body was rarely washed and the linen was changed every few months, diseases found ideal breeding conditions. The parasites not only caused itching and irritation, but also carried dangerous infections. We owe lice to one of the most terrible epidemics, typhus, which claimed thousands of lives in the Middle Ages. Nits and adults lived in the seams of clothing, and the smell from a person who had not washed for a long time was often a signal that his body and clothes had become a haven for disease vectors. Skin diseases, from small ulcers to purulent lesions. Constant sweat, dirt, and lack of ventilation in clothing created a humid and warm environment where the skin could not breathe. As a result, people often developed various dermatitis, boils, ulcers, and boils. Sweat soaked into the fabric decomposed, causing irritation and inflammation of the skin. It happened that a small abrasion or crack turned into a gangrene outbreak, especially if dirt from the street got into the wound. Feet often suffered. Shoes in the Middle Ages were rough and stiff, and stockings or footcloths were rarely washed. As a result, fungal infections developed, accompanied by stench, peeling, and ulcers that could develop into chronic diseases. Respiratory tract diseases. The stale state of the body and clothes not only created problems for the skin, but also affected the respiratory system. Inhaling air saturated with the odors of decay, smoke, and fumes weakened the lungs and led to chronic coughing. The townspeople, whose houses and streets were full of sewage, suffered from constant inflammation of the respiratory tract. The legends about miasma, poisonous fumes that allegedly caused diseases, were partly true. The stench of sewage and unwashed bodies really meant the presence of organic decomposition, and with it a high concentration of pathogenic particles in the air. The plague and the stink. A special place is occupied by the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which devastated Europe in the 14th century. Although the carriers were mainly rats and fleas, the conditions of unsanitary conditions and stale bodies contributed to the spread of the disease. Dirt, crowding, and lack of hygiene have made cities an ideal arena for epidemics. The stench of sweat-soaked and filthy crowds was part of the atmosphere in which the disease spread like lightning. Many contemporaries believed that it was the stench of infected bodies that could transmit the plague, and therefore burned the clothes and possessions of the dead, and fumigated houses with strong aromas, rosemary, juniper, resin. Internal diseases and odor. In the Middle Ages, people knew that some internal diseases also change body odor. For example, patients with severe diseases of the liver, kidneys, or lungs gave off a special, pungent aroma. But they couldn't explain it from a medical point of view. The smell was perceived as a blight or mark of sin, and treatment often consisted of prayers, fasting, and fumigation of the body. Often, bad breath was a sign of putrefactive processes in the teeth or stomach, but since dental medicine was primitive, doctors limited themselves to removing the most damaged teeth, and the unpleasant odor was masked with herbs and spices. the psychological aspect of smell and disease. Body odor could have not only physical, but also social consequences. In medieval cities, a person with a strong stench was considered either seriously ill or belonging to a lower class. This caused fear of infection and increased social isolation. The stink became a stigma, a sign of trouble, and sometimes a harbinger of death. Medieval ways to get rid of stink and dirt. In medieval Europe, unpleasant body odor was perceived differently than it is today. For a modern person, this is a signal for an immediate hygienic procedure, and for a resident of the 14th to 15th century, it is a natural part of life that hardly deserves much attention. Nevertheless, the people of that time were not indifferent to cleanliness. They had their own, albeit primitive, ways to deal with stench and dirt. These methods sometimes seemed strange or even dangerous, but for their contemporaries, they were the only available weapon against odor and disease. Bathing and baths are a rare luxury. Although bathing in Europe gradually became rare in the Middle Ages due to the fear of contracting diseases through water, the tradition of visiting baths still lived in some regions. This was especially true in the southern countries, Italy, Spain, and the south of France, where baths were often a legacy of the Roman Empire. Hot water was used in the baths, and the body was rubbed with coarse rags or washcloths. Soap in its usual form was expensive, so we used alkaline mixtures of ash and fat. After bathing, the skin was rubbed with aromatic oils, most often lavender or rosemary, to temporarily kill the smell of sweat. However, in cities with a cold climate, especially in England and northern France, baths were increasingly closed. The clergy considered them hotbeds of debauchery, and the doctors considered them a source of miasma. Therefore, bathing was replaced by other methods: dry cleaning and linen change. Where water was unavailable or dangerous, they resorted to dry cleansing. The body was wiped with linen cloths or a coarse cloth that absorbed sweat and dirt. Clothes and underwear were beaten out, shaken out and ventilated in the sun or frost, believing that fresh air expels the infection. Linen could be changed every few weeks or even months, depending on wealth. Rich townspeople and nobles ordered laundresses to wash in warm water with ashes and soap, while the poor were content with a simple rinse in the river. Odor against odor aromatic products. One of the most common ways to mask the stink was to use strong scents. Men and women carried pomanders, metal balls or pendants with holes inside which were mixtures of herbs, resins, spices, and essential oils. They exuded the scent of rose, lavender, rosemary, juniper, or cinnamon, interrupting the ambergris of the human body. Aromatic herbs such as sage, wormwood, and thyme were burned in houses and rooms. This was considered not only a way to improve the smell, but also a protection against diseases. The smoke purged the air of toxic fumes. Hair and beard care. Her hair, especially her long hair, absorbed the smells of smoke, food, and sweat. To refresh them, women rinsed their hair in decoctions of rosemary or chamomile, and men rubbed their beards with fragrant oils. Powders made from crushed flowers or wood ashes were rubbed into the hair and then combed out, removing dirt and parasites. Often, hair and beards were simply shaved off, not so much for hygiene reasons as to facilitate care and reduce the risk of lice. Cleansing of hands and face. Although full bathing was rare, hands and face were washed more often, especially before meals. Wooden basins with warm water and pieces of coarse soap or ash mixtures were used for this purpose. Sometimes vinegar was added to the water. It killed some of the odor and gave the skin a freshness. After washing, rich ladies wiped their faces with a cloth soaked in pink or orange water. It was more of a cosmetic procedure, but it also removed some of the dirt. Clothing as a barrier and as a problem. Outerwear often served as a kind of filter, hiding body odor and protecting the skin from dust. In winter, it trapped sweat, but in summer, it turned into a greenhouse. Therefore, special linings made of herbs and dried flowers were sold in the markets, which were inserted into the hem or sleeves of clothes. They slightly improved the smell, but did not fundamentally solve the problem. Sometimes a dress or doublet was taken to the laundry, where they were boiled in water with ashes and then beaten out. This killed some of the parasites and temporarily refreshed the tissue. Treatment of diseases caused by dirt. If dirt and odor led to skin diseases, doctors or healers offered ointments based on lard, wax, and herbs. For example, a mixture of honey, onion, and garlic was used for ulcers and boils. It really had antiseptic properties. Baths with salt or vinegar were used for the feet. They tried to remove the parasites with tar, sulfur, or wormwood infusion. These products had a pungent odor, but acted as insect repellents. Purification rituals and faith. In religious culture, purity of the body was often associated with purity of the soul. The pilgrims, returning from a long journey, had to wash themselves to wash away the sins of the road. Baptismal fonts were preserved in some monasteries, where monks and novices could wash the body several times a year. However, for most residents of medieval cities, cleansing was more of an episodic event than a permanent habit. Body odor was considered natural, and fighting it was optional, unless it bothered others or indicated illness. Masking the smell with food. Interestingly, some Europeans have tried to improve their smell by eating certain foods. So, chewing parsley, fennel, or mint not only refreshed your breath, but also, according to legend, made the smell of sweat more pleasant. However, heavy consumption of garlic or onions had the opposite effect, although it was believed that it improves health. Result: the methods of odor control in the Middle Ages were far from modern hygiene standards. Most of them masked the problem rather than fixing it. But even these primitive measures gave people a feeling of freshness and security, albeit temporarily. In their world full of smells, fumes, and miasma, body freshness was the exception rather than the rule, and therefore doubly appreciated.